IVM.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Welcome to All Things Policy. On October 7th of last year, that is 2022, the US Department of Commerce implemented controls connected to advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing in China. And this was done citing the need to protect US national security and foreign policy interests. Basically, there are a set of export controls, you could say sanctions on Chinese chip manufacturing. But what has happened in the 1 year since then? Has the US actually achieved what it set out to achieve? We most recently heard that Huawei had come up with a 7-nanometer chip of its own. So does this mean that these sanctions were all for nothing? To discuss this, I'm joined by Satya Sahu, who knows more about this than I can. Who knows more about this than I can imagine. So, Satya, I want to ask you. Firstly, welcome to All Things Policy. And why did the Americans actually implement these export controls last year, soon after the CHIPS Act was passed? What were their objectives? What did they think they were going to achieve?
Hi, Aditya. It's great to be on All Things Policy again after last week. So the stated goals are the only ones I can attribute to the United States of America's Department of Commerce, who came out with the export controls themselves. I think it was a part of the strategy alongside the CHIPS Act, because it came in just a few months after the CHIPS Act was pushed through Congress. Ostensibly, it was to prevent the People's Republic of China's ability to access and develop advanced computing and semiconductor manufacturing items, which they say was used to produce advanced military systems, including WMDs, improve accuracy and speed of military decision-making, planning, as well as autonomous military systems. And also they add in a bit about how it's used to commit human rights abuses at the end. Now, there's under these parameters, they also wanted to hinder China's ambitions for leadership in AI and supercomputing by 2030. Not sure why they chose 2030 as a threshold, but they're saying that these were used to bring about capabilities to monitor, track, and surveil their own citizens. I mean, probably we haven't seen many attempts by governments elsewhere in the world to surveil their own citizens. So I guess it was important to specify that the US wouldn't stand for something like this. Anyway, so going to the meat of the sanctions, what it essentially established was that there can be no direct trade between US entities and Chinese ones. But also, and this is important, is that indirectly any foreign company that incorporates US technology in its product or services also cannot do so, or their access to the US owned tech will be cut off. For instance, ASML, the world's only producer of extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment, which is used to fabricate semiconductors and chips, incorporates a lot of US owned patents in their development. And also a lot of US based companies provide the subcomponents of their equipment. So you know that when the sanctions took place, they had to comply immediately. Right. Now, the export controls were imposed on a few key areas. On certain advanced computing semiconductor chips, for instance, what every AI startup is trying to get their hands on these days, which is the NVIDIA H100 chip, specifically for accelerating AI training processes, as well as transactions for supercomputer end users, which is when we basically purchase a time slice of a cloud-based service provider, where an entity can process whatever they need to within that time frame, like scientific calculations that requires a lot of processing power. You rent, say, around 5 hours of time of your nearest supercomputer on your calculation, and that's it. You don't pay for the 10,000 NVIDIA H100 GPUs present in that supercomputer, but you're getting advantage of that tech. And finally, also restrictions on transactions with any entity on a blacklist. It's called the entity list. It's a blacklist. There are also other details about foreign governments and if they prevent checking up by the Department of Commerce on any entity present in their shores that can potentially be on the entity list, then there's a whole unverified list also. but I'm not aware of the nitty-gritties of it. Then the second part is the restrictions and license requirements on certain semiconductor manufacturing items, as well as restrictions on US persons who to support the development and production of integrated circuits. Now, integrated circuits is a much more wide-ranging term compared to chips. At certain Chinese-located semiconductor fabrication facilities without a license. Now, licenses are pretty difficult to get hold of, but also basically being situated in China is going to pretty much put you in a blacklist. Now, to give context, previously we had seen the Trump administration pass laws to ban Huawei and ZTE equipment from government agencies and subsequently completely declare them as national security threats. But this set of measures by the Biden admin is striking at the very roots of the global supply chain for semiconductors. So, because the cutting edge of the supply chain is so hyper globalized, but simultaneously hyper specialized also, because at each stage, only a handful of firms in the world can do it. And if you're sort of locked out of any one of those stages, then you can't make chips.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But how dependent is the United States chips ecosystem on China? Because the first thing that people here, besides talk about TSMC and so on, is how dependent are Americans on, say, R&D facilities or manufacturing facilities in China? How much is it going to affect their ability to produce chips and produce them cost effectively?
So a lot of research and development that goes into chip design is made in India as well, by the way, and in the US or in other countries. China generally is used for, there are some fabrication facilities by other trailing edge nodes in China. But primarily, the reason why China is so important is because packaging, testing, and everything happens there, right? And so when it comes to chip design itself, the US is pretty much the world leader. And all the EDA tools, the tools that are used to actually design the intricate chips themselves, this happened on the scale of nanometers and angstroms, right? So, and these tools are all owned by US companies. It's an oligopoly of 3 or 4 companies, if I remember correctly. So, as far as I know, the supply chain is heavily dependent on China because of the cheap labor, the inputs, the raw materials. However, China has also now established restrictions on exports of these raw materials. We'll have to wait and see how that pans out because it's a more recent development compared to the US export controls themselves. But so the supply chain is fairly dependent on China, but not in a way that the US cannot possibly supplant this. But at the moment, building resilience and building diversification is difficult. Yeah.
Yeah. Our colleague Pranay likes to say that decoupling typically happens on the level of materials, on machines, humans, and ideas. And that the precise pathway in which the decoupling happens will be different in each technology sector. So for semiconductors, it will be different than, say, from biotechnology or space or so on. Which part of this decoupling do you think is going to hit China most? Is it, for example, that US persons cannot operate there, or is it because they won't have access to machines or certain parts of the supply chains, or perhaps even emerging ideas, for example, in design of AI chips?
Yeah, so this is where I would also like make an assessment of whether those objectives have met progress. The objectives of the export controls. This is the stated objective of the export controls themselves, that they want to hinder China at stages where they cannot build capacity immediately or if ever, because some of these technologies are very difficult to come up with on their own. So there's a recent Wall Street Journal report as well, is where Chinese companies themselves say that they're struggling to get key components and machinery. So equipment is particularly the weak point in the supply chain, because like I said, ASML is the only company in the world to make deep ultraviolet and extreme ultraviolet lithography equipment. There are also Canon and Nikon in Japan, but they are quite a few. The technology is quite a bit behind ASML's, and all the leading edge chips in the world use ASML technology exclusively. And there's also issues where if chip designs are being remodeled to make them less powerful, so that or less, if a particular chip is designed on a 12 nanometer fabrication node, and 12 nanometer fabrication node processing equipment is now not available to China because of the US export controls, but they do have a legacy 14 nanometer processing node available with all the equipment for it. But the chip design that they have in place needs to be transposed to be able to be produced on that node. It's not very easy to do that at all, because chip design and fabrication are so intertwined. And also there is debatable terminology when speaking about what counts as 12 nm for a particular foundry versus another. Transposing that would be exceedingly difficult, because you cannot maintain power or efficiency envelopes, performance or thermal requirements. This is also where we see that reportedly China's recent customs data show that imports of semiconductors fell by 22% in the first 6 months of 2023, as well as chip manufacturing equipment also dropped by 23%. I think it was after the deadline of the export controls got over. So in this case, I would say equipment is the chip manufacturing equipment is the primary bottleneck here for as far as China is concerned, because design, etc. I mean, not counting espionage and everything, design, etc. is a ever evolving process, and that can be solved to a certain extent, the human factor, but the technology requirement is extremely difficult to what do you call it, bridge.
Right. Yeah. This brings up some really interesting questions that I want to get to. But I mean, to me, one of the obvious pitfalls from this sort of export control seems to be that the Americans are potentially giving up a lot of leverage that they have over the Chinese, in these things, and they're actually encouraging, over the long term at least, Chinese chip independence. Now, of course, for the Chinese to get truly Atmanirbhar with chips, like you've indicated, is actually probably going to take a while. And the American bet is like that they're going to maintain a sufficient lead. By the way, the CHIPS Act is actually the US Chips and Science Act of 2022, and CHIP stands for Creating Helpful Incentives to Produce Semiconductors and Science Act. I mean, so basically, even if the Americans don't remain a generation or two ahead of the Chinese in chips in the future, they'll, I think, remain a generation or two ahead of everyone in the world in acronyms, right? I mean, they've just mastered that. But I mean, more seriously, Satya, we spoke about this, Huawei coming up with this 7 nanometer chip. Does this mean that the sanctions, the export controls have failed, or how significant of a breakthrough is this?
Yeah. So publicly, the U.S. Commerce Secretary, I think Gina Raimondo, stated that the U.S. found no evidence that the Chinese smartphone maker Huawei can produce smartphones with advanced semiconductors at scale. Now, there's a online publication called Tech Insights that tore the phone down. The phone is called Mate 60 Pro. And they analyzed the system on chip, and they said it was fabricated on a 7 nanometer process. So at an engineering level, this does mark progress on SMIC's end, the Chinese foundry, to be able to do this without advanced DUV or EUV equipment that they're proscribed from getting because of the export controls. However, the operative part is at scale. Now, silicon wafer yields are one of the primary factors that determine whether something is just a proof of concept or commercially viable for mass production. From what little we know, it doesn't seem like SMIC is getting high wafer yields using this lithography process. Now, this is going to become a little bit technical, and I am also not an engineer, so hopefully I'm describing it in a way that captures the essence of it. So to etch the design of the chip onto the silicon, you use extreme ultraviolet or DUV light or deep ultraviolet light and expose the silicon to the design pattern, just like you would say expose analog film for photography back in the day. Now, the margin for error is microscopic, almost atomic. So the less exposures needed to etch the pattern onto the chip, the better. So you'll have less errors and less defective chips that come out of it. Now, one of the ways in which smaller fabrication nodes like 7 nanometers can be simulated is by using, say, 14 nanometer fabrication processes, where the wavelength of the light is 14 nanometer here. And then you make partial exposures of the chip design onto the silicon, move the silicon a bit, and make another exposure, and so on. Now, there's an insane amount of technicality that goes into it. So hopefully, again, I'm getting this right. But anyway, this means that the possibility of errors and defective chips being created due to the movement of the silicon, and each additional exposure increases by quite a bit. So, and that seems to be what SMIC has been doing. We will not know because it is very difficult to figure out what process has been used by analyzing the chip itself. It's very difficult to do that. So it's definitely cause for concern for the US to investigate, as a lot of Congress and House of Representatives people are pushing for stricter measures, export control measures, as well as adding guardrails to the CHIPS Act to make sure that no Chinese connected entities are able to get subsidies or human capital or knowledge to make this happen. So it's definitely cause for concern for the US to investigate, but it's definitely not indicative of the fact that sanctions have failed. Like I mentioned earlier, chip imports, like the actual imports of semiconductors, fell by 22%, and manufacturing equipment also fell by more than 20% since last year. As well as since there have been some lifting of restrictions or some caveats to the export controls since then, even Nvidia, who is the world's leading supplier for AI accelerator chips, they are not providing the latest and greatest chips to China. They're trying to get around it by creating some sort of architectural changes in their chips and creating a separate chip for China only. But yeah, so the sanctions are definitely working. Not we don't know how effective they will be in a medium to long term, but we'll see.
Stay tuned to All Things Policy. We'll be right back after a short commercial break.
Okay, but are the Americans going to look at this? And so, I mean, basically at this stage, taking stock, you have three options. You can either go back on some of your export controls, you can maintain them, or you can expand them. I'm expecting that at least for now that they're not going to go back on export controls. So what is likely to be the American strategy in the years ahead? Are they likely to maintain these controls, or are they likely to expand them and may just make it even more and more difficult for China to get access to key technology from elsewhere?
It's actually a very difficult question. I mean, assuming the current administration continues next year, or if a different administration comes into power and they decide to stick with it, there's no getting around the fact that the Chinese market is still the world's largest market for consumer semiconductor chips, not even accounting for enterprise demand for this, right? So yeah, I think it's around 35% or so for the world semiconductor market. So, I mean, so companies definitely do not want this to happen, where it undercuts their sales. And also, like countries like Korea and Japan have been pretty vocal in their dissatisfaction with this, because a lot of memory chips that Korean giants like Samsung makes and SK Hynix make have their go to China because of data centers and everything. So, and Korea also passed their own CHIPS Act and everything, but at the end, there's so much you can do only on the supply side, that you also need the consumer demand to actually create products for. So it's a difficult question to ask. When you put AI development into it becomes even more complex, because when you have state-sponsored companies in China using last generation or like 2 generation old AI accelerator chips to develop their AI applications or models, whatever, compared to US's the cutting edge technology, cutting edge chips as well as cutting edge foundational models, obviously then there'll be a huge outcry, because again, AI accelerator chip companies would want to sell the latest and greatest to as many people as possible. But then supply chain is already saturated for them. Like the demand is so high in countries, not just China, any like Europe and America, that the supply chain is already saturated. So we don't know how that is also going to pan out, because if the supply chain increases or extends, if other companies begin to make those chips, if I don't know, if someone other than Nvidia begins to control the market as well, become a good competitor, that can make things very difficult as well to predict. So really, there is no answer at this point. But yeah, they're not going to roll back any of this export controls. It's definitely what they're talking about a national security concern is probably true, in the sense that they do not want Chinese companies to have some sort of control over US equipment or other US companies. But yeah, so the sanctions are not going to be rolled back. Whether or not they'll extend the sanctions and how that's going to affect other foreign governments, we'll have to see.
Yeah. Since chip semiconductors are meta critical, this is obviously going to have massive downstream effects down the line, with to China's economy, its international competitiveness, its military capabilities, all of those things. But outside of China, I'm guessing you also have a lot of unhappy folks among American companies. Certainly in South Korea, a lot of unhappy people. But what does all of this mean for India? Should Indians be unhappy or happy? Or what are the upsides, if any, for India from the chip sanctions?
The upsides are plenty. The geopolitical opportunities are plenty. The moment the CHIPS Act and the export controls came into effect, there's already a slight push towards diversification of supply chains away from China. By that point, because of COVID-19 and I mean the disruption of supply chains causing problems. So companies had begun processes to identify which other countries they can possibly shift some of their operations to, so it doesn't hinder them. And especially in semiconductors, it's a huge deal because TSMC produces around 60% of the most advanced chips in the world. I mean, other countries do make chips as well, but they are not advanced. They're not the leading edge ones, that 28 nm or greater fabrication nodes. So, and combined with the fact that Chinese military posturing is always adds that the spice of uncertainty and everything. In this case, I would say India is situated very well to become a operations hub for a lot of companies that operate in the semiconductor value chain. So assembly, packaging, and testing. OSAT, ATMP, and OSAT is something we call them, because we have a highly technically trained workforce. We have very good English language skills, and at the infrastructure required for ATMP and OSAT is comparatively much cheaper and easier to set up compared to whole fabrication plants and everything, which require water, electricity, and the human labor, and labor that is willing to work 12-hour shifts, etc. If TSMC is to be believed. So at some level, India is very well poised to take advantage of this shift. But at the same time, there are things that are endemic to Indian circumstances that make it difficult for companies to shift operations here. First is the trade policy and tariff structure is extremely ad hoc. It creates a whole bunch of instability in terms of decision making, especially where huge capital expenditure is involved in the semiconductor industry. So I forgot, there's a Japanese company that came here, and the CEO specifically echoed this sentiment, which is that because of ad hoc tariff rises and everything, it is difficult to make long-standing decision making. Also, we had a recent EU dispute where India diverged away from its information technology agreement obligations, and that is an agreement which is basically a WTO plurilateral agreement, which ensures that input components as well as like final products, laptops, and electronic ICT products, basically information communication technology products, can be exported and imported without trade barriers, without customs duties and everything. Now, India was a signatory in 1997, but over time, as we have begun the whole Atmanirbhar process and everything, we have begun charging customs duty like very blatantly on product categories that are covered under the ITA. There are multiple arguments that India has made, but the WTO has ruled against it. So that is also like not a great signal for global companies to want to come to India, because they will have to absorb the costs of increased components. Because in India, we do not have the capacity to make a lot of these very specialized components that require. We don't have the R&D or the IP that is needed to make these, and also we don't have the facilities to make this. So when companies do shift their operations here, they will have to absorb the cost of these input components, they also have to absorb the costs of exporting the final product away out of India, etc. So aside from that, we have infrastructural problems with, like that's been a constant story over decades. Now that can be improved in specific cases, but that is not a good signal to global companies to want to shift supply chains. But yeah, so India is very well placed for these reasons, but that there's a lack of political will to make that happen because of this whole Atmanirbhar narrative. So yeah.
Yeah, the Micron deal earlier this year convinced a lot of Indians that we'd basically be the prime beneficiaries of the CHIPS Act. But I think the jury's still out on that, and we'll have to keep tracking that here at Takshashila. Thankfully, we have both Satya and Pranay to help us through that. I mean, they cover this subject, like I feel confident in saying, like no one else does in India. So do check out their work. And, whenever Satya is on All Things Policy, make it a point to listen. All right. So thank you so much, Satya.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Aditya.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.